Welcome to the Mentally Strong Grief series. I'm Cristi Bundukamara, psychiatric nurse practitioner with over 20 years of clinical experience, but more importantly, I have lost 3 children over the course of 17 years. And I am going through a process of going over grief theories as well as a personal public journey of grief. Today, I'm going to be talking about the dual process theory of bereavement. And this is actually a fairly new one, developed and published in 1999. And it's very different than the other theories that really kind of have step-by-step processes or tasks or elements that they describe people with grief going through. I think that this is a great grief theory, just in my professional and personal experience. However, like many of them that I review, I think there are still some missing components. But it is great for us to begin to start talking about grief in more of a dialectical, balanced thinking rather than a step-by-step, task-oriented process. So, the dual process theory talks about 2 places that we are as a person, right? That's going through grief. So one is loss orientation. We are trying to do grief work. We are trying to grieve. We are trying to, feel that pain and process and move forward. And they call that loss orientation. And then the other side of that, they call restoration orientation. And other grief theories call it different things, growing in grief. They call it reinvesting in life, reintegration. There's different words for this, but they call it here restoration orientation, like the things that you are doing to try to kind of get back into the world, get back into life and find that purpose. So in this theory, they talk about these 2 things, maybe like a seesaw, where you're kind of going back and forth between these 2 orientations, right? So in your loss orientation, you're doing your grief work, but maybe you're even having periods of time where there's intrusive grief. And even as I talk about and practice controlled grief, right? This is where you take a specific time to do your grief work, that you are in control of it so that it doesn't kind of flood you at inappropriate times. I still have intrusive grief that happens. I could be somewhere and a Facebook memory pops up, or I'm looking at my phone and a Facebook memory pops up, or a photo memory pops up of my daughter swimming with her mermaid tail in our pool in Daytona, right? And even just talking about it now, I got like a little emotional escalation, right? That's called intrusive grief. And that is part of the loss orientation that they talk about in this dual process. The restoration orientation is where you're attending life. You're trying to make those adjustments, those changes that we talk about, and you're trying to do new things, maybe distract from your pain and your grief, and you kind of go between those 2 and oscillating. The reason I really like this grief theory is because it talks about it. If you look at the kind of diagram that they give for this, it has a big circle and then these 2 ovals that are oscillating back and forth. And that's really more of how we are actually trying to function in our day-to-day life. What I often find with those that are experiencing intense grief, that the loss orientation is so much bigger and feels heavier, right? If you think about it like a seesaw, and that's not how they visualize it, but I visualize it like a seesaw. Like the loss orientation seems so much heavier that the mental energy it takes for the restoration orientation is just very exhausting. And so, but I think if we are doing this properly, that we can have this balance. And so I will put in there again that we have to schedule that controlled grief. Otherwise, the intrusive grief will just keep coming through. In this dual process theory, they talk about denial and avoidance as a regular thing. And it's kind of in the loss orientation, you're confronting that loss, you're trying to feel the pain. In the restoration, you're avoiding. And again, you're kind of going back and forth, oscillating between those two. And I would say that even when I'm personally in that restoration orientation, I'm trying to reinvest in life, I'm not avoiding my grief. So for me, this wasn't like two distinct areas, but I do like this kind of oscillating and maybe even incorporating and integrating if we look at some of the other grief theories. But the goal, I think, in the completion of a grief process is to negotiate a meaningful life. And we know, and I talk about this over and over again, that in intense grief, like losing a child, losing a husband, losing someone that you spend a lot of time with, that grief process is never complete. But if you go back and look at this diagram that they made for dual process orientation, I can see that over time, the grief loss orientation kind of oval can decrease as far as the time and energy needed to be in that space, right? But there's still going to be oscillation. I mean, even I can give an example. 17 years ago, my son Johnny died in a drowning accident. Sudden, obviously no warning. He was pulled from the water, dead. There was no, hope that he would be revived. And 17 years later, I started a little bit of trauma work this week, and we started with that. And there was emotional escalation, grief that came up associated with this loss 17 years ago. So there's not a completion of any grief process or grief theory in intense grief. However, I do like this, idea of it's oscillating, it's a balance, like, we should be trying to spend as much time in this restoration orientation as we are in the loss orientation. And even now, I'm personally going through 45 days of grief where every single day I'm trying to do controlled grief. I'm trying to take care of myself. I'm trying to self-regulate and do this process kind of actively every day. But part of that process is also living life and readjusting and getting into this restoration orientation. So if you are personally going through grief, and I encourage you to study these grief processes and really acknowledge where they trigger you, right? Because I talk about in some of the other videos. But, what can you learn from this? And what I learned from it was I want to be spending just as much time in that restoration, readjusting, reinvesting in my life so that I can find meaning and purpose while I give the needed attention to loss orientation, okay? Because if we do not give that needed attention, right, and we talk about this in other videos, the grief gets enmeshed in everything else in our life, including our negative thoughts. And, I've been kind of trying to untangle that myself as I'm going through this 45 days of grief, that, things that were traumatic in my life, I'm trying to separate that from the grief. The negative things, the negative dialogue that I have in my mind, I'm trying to readjust that's not part of my grief. And so making sure that as we're going through this grief process, and we're oscillating, we're going back and forth. For me, think of it like a seesaw and, or a balance scale where we're actually trying to oscillate in the air and spending the appropriate amount of time and energy in both loss orientation and restoration orientation. This is a very difficult journey for intense grief, but we can do it. And I think the dual process does give us some insight into how to do that. Keep going on your grief journey. Join me, follow me as we get stronger together, because I do believe that you are mentally strong.